YouTube is worth more than the entire GDP of Thailand, a country of almost 72 million people. In the empire that is Google, YouTube is the crown jewel. In financial terms, it is probably the single best acquisition of all time, costing Google just $1.65 billion back in 2006. But how much exactly is YouTube worth today? Now, without being its own company, something that might happen sooner rather than later, it's impossible to know exactly what an independent YouTube will be worth. But we're gonna make a guess anyway, and there are two main ways we can do this. The first is by taking a look at comparable businesses, seeing what the market is willing to pay for those businesses, and then applying those numbers to YouTube. The second is to strip down YouTube's numbers and figure out how much all of YouTube's future cash flows should be worth today. And we'll do this in part 2 of the series. But let's get to the multiples. A simple way to think about using a multiple to value a business is this. You're at a store and the apples have a price, but the oranges don't. Trying to figure out what price is fair, you and the shopkeeper take a look at the price of apples and deem that oranges are similar enough that you can use their price per pound as the price per pound for the oranges. This is the exact same process that happens in finance, just with a lot more going on behind the scenes. And just like apples and oranges aren't exactly the same, no two businesses are entirely identical either. One business might sell organic lemonade, the other regular lemonade. One might be a beloved warehouse-based retailer with cheap hot dogs, and another might not be Costco. When it comes to YouTube, there are a few comparables that I think feel most appropriate, but of course, not totally identical. The first is probably the one you were thinking of, Netflix. I don't think I need to explain why Netflix should be a comparable to YouTube, but there are some pretty important differences between YouTube's and Netflix's business models that we'll talk about later. The other comparable is Spotify. Like YouTube, Spotify is a marketplace for entertainment, although, like Netflix, it has some pretty important differences when compared to YouTube. With these two comparables in mind, let's try to figure out what YouTube is worth. First, the Netflix comparable. Like YouTube, Netflix offers a wide array of content, and like YouTube, Netflix makes money both from subscriptions and nowadays from ads. But from here, the two businesses are going to become quite different. Most of Netflix's costs are largely high and fixed, and that means that when Netflix makes a new show, it costs them huge amounts of money, but once that show is made, the cost of each new person who watches the show is extremely low, and if that show is a big hit, it can generate enormous ROI for Netflix. YouTube is the reverse of this. While YouTube doesn't have to pay anything to get something on the platform, they do have to pay 55% of every dollar of net ad sales to their creators. In theory, YouTube could try to tweak this margin, but then they'd risk annoying creators who are responsible for 100% of the supply that makes YouTube as a marketplace work. Which of these models is better is something that is up to you and the market. They both have pros and cons, and both have strong competitive advantages that make it very, very hard for any new entrant, even other established media brands, to compete effectively against either. But for a few reasons, I think YouTube should probably trade at a slight premium to Netflix. First, I believe there's less risk with YouTube. They don't have to spend as aggressively on marketing to bring people in. Being a mostly free offering keeps it even more recession resilient than Netflix, and the long-term profitability outlook for YouTube is extremely strong. While Netflix may have to periodically spend big to refresh their catalog for new tastes, YouTube's creators do that for them, at no fixed cost to YouTube. YouTube only pays when YouTube gets paid. On the flip side, because YouTube tends to be more ad dependent than Netflix, one could argue its revenues are more volatile and therefore should not trade at a premium. I could go further on this back and forth, but hopefully you agree with me about why I think YouTube should be worth a premium to Netflix. If you disagree with me, I am more than happy to have a civil discussion about it in the comments. Ultimately though, it's the market who will decide who's right. Based on current market prices, Netflix is trading at a multiple of about 12 times its run rate revenue. Run rate revenue is just what its next 12 months of revenue would be if it continues at the same level it is currently at. So using that multiple from Netflix, we need to multiply 12 by YouTube's run rate. But what is YouTube's run rate? It can actually be quite tricky to figure this out. While YouTube's advertising revenue is made very clear in Alphabet's filings, it's not totally fair to use that as a run rate, since advertising revenue tends to be seasonal, peaking around the Christmas holiday season in Q4. Then there are subscriptions, and it's not easy to figure out how many YouTube Premium subscriptions there are, since YouTube lumps this figure together with other Google service offerings. So to come up with YouTube's run rate, I took an estimate I found online for YouTube's subscription revenue of about $11 billion, and then I added that to my estimate for 2025 ad revenue, which I calculate by taking the growth percentage YouTube saw in Q1 2025, and then applying that to the full year 2024 revenue to come up with a full year 2025 projection. This landed me at a rough 2025 run rate figure for YouTube of just shy of $51 billion, which I'll round down to $50 billion for the sake of simplicity. Therefore, if we multiply the figure we got from Netflix by YouTube's run rate, that gets us to an implied valuation of $600 billion for YouTube. Now, if you believe my argument that YouTube should trade at a premium to Netflix, we have to figure out what that premium should be. To approximate what the premium should be, let's look at the difference between Netflix's operating margin when removing general and administrative costs and YouTube's 45% cut. The reason I do this is to try to compare what Netflix has to pay for things like marketing and content creation to what YouTube has to pay for those in the form of its creator payouts. In simpler terms, we're comparing how much Netflix keeps per dollar they earn versus how much YouTube keeps per dollar they earn. I think this method is valid because in theory investors should pay more per dollar of revenue if each dollar of revenue results in more profit. For Netflix, that adjusted operating margin is 35.74%, and therefore YouTube's 45% margin is a bit less than 26% higher than Netflix's. Adding a 26% premium to the $600 billion valuation from earlier gives YouTube an implied valuation of just over $755 billion. Now let's run through the same process again with Spotify. The differences between Spotify and YouTube are obvious, but there are many similarities as well. Spotify, like YouTube, tends to have variable content costs. The more you play a song, the more they have to pay for music. And like YouTube, they both have ad-supported and free versions, but the differences, obviously, are also quite large. Spotify sources the majority of its content not from a huge variety of usually independent creators, but from 3 major studios. While Spotify has significant leverage with the studios now that they've achieved scale, this still leaves them relatively vulnerable compared to YouTube. Similarly, because of this dynamic, Spotify tends to have to pay out a significantly higher share of revenues to the labels than YouTube has to pay to its creators. Of course, YouTube creators generally get to keep far more of their earnings than musicians get to keep from Spotify payouts, but that is a discussion for a different time. So with those caveats, it would probably be fair to price YouTube at a premium to Spotify as well. Spotify trades at roughly 8 times its Q1 2025 revenue run rate. Using this figure, YouTube's implied valuation would be $400 billion. To approximate the premium we should apply to YouTube, I use the same method I did for Netflix. Spotify reported gross margins of roughly 31.65% in their latest quarterly update. YouTube's gross margins of roughly 45% are about 42% higher than Spotify's. The implied multiple for YouTube based on that becomes 11.36 times revenue, which will give YouTube an implied value of roughly $575 billion. Now, I think the final step in this entire process is to do a little bit of a gut check. Do these numbers actually feel reasonable? My personal belief is the answer is yes. While I think you could question if the market is pricing Spotify or Netflix appropriately, the general range of values it implies for YouTube feels right. YouTube is an integral part of digital life in 2025. I basically grew up with YouTube, and those younger than me even more so. I've never had a traditional cable package, and probably never will, and while I'll pay for premium streaming services from time to time, YouTube is always an option, regardless of your taste or budget. No other place on the internet can random people post multi-hour-long documentaries on obscure subjects and actually find a loyal viewing audience. And while that is a beautiful thing, when you're the business that can make that happen profitably, when you get to own that network effect, you're going to be worth a lot of money. People post on YouTube because the audience is there, and the audience comes to YouTube because the content is there. And those are the types of dynamics that are extremely sticky and extremely valuable. Make sure to subscribe for part 2 when we dive into YouTube's discounted cash flow valuation.